comedian used his show to do serious issues.
For 30 years, Johnny Carson invited America into what looked like his living room. The desk, the couch, the mug, the easy laugh. Every night felt like a friendly visit with Hollywood's brightest stars. Viewers at home believed they were seeing the real person behind the movie posters. What they didn't know was that the man behind the desk often knew far more than he could ever say on air. He knew where the public image ended and the secret life began. He knew which marriages were for love, which were for contracts, and which were carefully built by studios to hide the truth in plain sight. People who worked near Carson in the 70s and 80s have said the same quiet thing for years. Johnny knew everything. Agents confided in him. Producers gossiped in the green room. Nervous publicists begged him to stay away from certain questions. Stars would stride onto the stage, flash a perfect smile, talk about the wife, the kids, the dream home in the hills, and Johnny would nod along, fully aware that the romance they were selling to America wasn't real. As he grew older and more reflective, he reportedly stopped seeing those performances as harmless Hollywood myth and started seeing them as something heavier, people living out entire lives behind glass, trapped in roles they'd never auditioned for. Few guests fascinated Johnny more than the most polished of them all, Cary Grant. By the time Grant sat in the chair opposite Carson, he wasn't just a movie star. He was a concept. The tailored suits, the perfect timing, the accent that was neither English nor American, but somehow more charming than both. Carson admired him as an artist, but he was very aware that Cary Grant was a character Archibald Leach had built to protect himself. In private conversations, Johnny was said to be struck by the gap between the public Cary, who joked about ex-wives and leading ladies, and the man who had once shared a home for years with fellow actor Randolph Scott in a Santa Monica beach house insiders called Bachelor Hall. Fan magazines of the time printed photo spreads of the two men cooking, sunbathing, working out together, sold to the public as cute bachelor roommates. Hollywood knew there was more to it. Carson knew too. And every time he chatted with Grant on air about his latest marriage, he had to pretend, along with everyone else, that the photographs from that beach house were just friendship. If Grant was the gentleman illusion, Katharine Hepburn was the rebel one. When Hepburn came on the show, sharp as broken glass. Funny. No nonsense. Carson treated her with a special kind of respect. He knew he was talking to someone who had ducked every box the industry tried to put her in. The trousers, the clipped voice, the refusal to play America's sweetheart. It fascinated him. So did the long, carefully tended myth of her 26-year love affair with Spencer Tracy. To the public, they were the greatest screen couple that ever lived, the devoted partners who sacrificed everything for each other. But people close to Carson say he believed their bond, however deep, also functioned as a shield. For Tracy, a devout Catholic who would not divorce, it explained why he lived away from his wife. For Hepburn, it gave the world a straight romance to point to, while the women she was closest to, friends like Laura Harding and Phyllis Wilborn, stayed discreetly in the background. Johnny never outed her, never pushed, but in private reflection, he reportedly called the Tracy Hepburn saga the most successful cover story Hollywood ever wrote. If Hepburn and Grant were legends of control, Rock Hudson was the one Johnny couldn't stop thinking about in terms of fear. Hudson was a frequent Tonight Show guest in the 60s and 70s, towering over the desk with movie star shoulders and that easy grin. Audiences loved it when Carson teased him about his on-screen romances with Doris Day or asked about his dating life. They saw it as playful banter. People behind the curtain saw something else, a man doing everything he could to keep his hands steady. By then, Johnny knew what most of Hollywood knew, that Hudson was gay. that his agent Henry Wilson had helped arrange a brief marriage to Phyllis Gates, to quiet rumors. That every romantic anecdote on the couch was essentially part of an ongoing studio script. Carson wasn't interested in shaming him. What unsettled him, according to colleagues, was the machinery around Hudson, publicists hovering in the wings, pre-interview notes warning, "No personal questions." The knowledge that one careless improvisation from the host could destroy a man's career overnight. Later in life, when Hudson's AIDS diagnosis forced his private truth into public view, Carson reportedly said it broke his heart that rock had been forced to live under that kind of pressure for decades. Hudson wasn't the only one sitting under that weight. Raymond Burr, who arrived in Carson's studio as the beloved face of Perry Mason and Ironside, had built an even more intricate fiction. On air, Burr spoke gravely about lost wives, tragic children, wartime experiences, stories that biographers later found to be almost entirely fabricated. Off-screen, he shared his life quietly with his partner Robert Benavides for more than 3 decades. Carson, a man whose entire job was asking questions, had to look across at America's favorite champion of truth and cross-examination and pretend he believed the mythology. People close to the show have said those were some of the interviews that weighed on Johnny the most, not because he disapproved of Burr's private life, but because the amount of lying required to keep it private felt suffocating. Not every star lived in fear, at least not in the same way. Marlene Dietrich walked onto Carson's stage like she had nothing left to hide, wrapped in tailored suits or shimmering gowns, with that low voice and sly smile. She talked about lovers of both sexes with a wink that seemed to say, "You already know." In Europe, her sexual fluidity was part of her aura. In Hollywood, the studio system had tried to sand down the edges, but she never fully played along. Carson loved having her on. She baffled sponsors, but she thrilled him. Here, finally, was someone whose androgyny, open marriage, and secret liaisons weren't just hidden. They were woven into her star power. Dietrich didn't need a lavender marriage. She turned ambiguity itself into box office. To Johnny, she was proof that the system could bend if the star was strong enough to hold her ground. Then there was Marlon Brando, who, for all his insistence on truth in acting, spent years carefully managing which truths about himself the public could see. By the time Brando sat opposite Carson, he was already the patron saint of raw emotion. The man who had made vulnerability masculine in On the Waterfront and A Streetcar Named Desire. Whispers about his relationships with both men and women had floated around town for years. Later in life, Brando would casually confirm he'd loved men as well as women, but during his Tonight Show era, it was all subtext. Carson saw the contradiction clearly. A man whose art demanded emotional nakedness, wrapped in his own private secrecy. The host admired him, but he never forgot how much energy Brando spent building and guarding his own myth, even as he smashed everyone else's. James Dean haunted the show without ever having sat in Johnny's chair. Dean died in 1955, years before Carson took over The Tonight Show. But his shadow lingered in every young rebel actor who walked on stage. Johnny heard the same stories everyone else in town heard, that Dean had blurred lines between sex, power, and ambition in his climb through the studio system, that powerful older men had bankrolled his rise, that some of his bravado hid a more complicated private truth. Carson didn't condemn Dean for that. What bothered him, according to some who knew him, was the system underneath, the one that made desperate kids see intimacy as currency, and then turned them into legends too young to ever tell their side of the story. Dean's early death froze him at 24, forever straight, forever tragic, forever uncomplicated in the public imagination. Johnny suspected the reality was far more complicated. Carson's curiosity extended beyond American stars. He knew the stories about Charles Laughton and Elsa Lanchester, two brilliant British imports whose unconventional marriage baffled gossip columnists for years. Laughton, by many accounts, was gay. Lanchester had her own attractions outside the marriage. Yet together they crafted a public partnership that protected them both. Talk show appearances by Elsa tended to dance gracefully around the subject, offering just enough charm to keep the myth intact. Johnny respected the craftsmanship of it. A double beard, as some later biographers would call it, two people walking arm in arm, letting the world believe one story while living another. He found it both ingenious and strangely sad. Tyrone Power fit a different pattern. On Carson's radar, mostly through stories told by older guests and studio veterans, Power represented a classic case of the matinee idol caught in his own reflection. His beauty sold romance, swashbuckling fantasies, a certain kind of straight, heroic longing. Behind the screen, rumors swirled of a more fluid private life, late-night escapes, and careful compartmentalization. To Johnny, Power was a reminder that sometimes the very thing that makes someone a star, the face, the body, the fantasy, also becomes a cage. Power's early death at 44 locked that cage forever. Whatever truths were waiting to surface went into the ground with him. And then there was the kind of story Carson heard over and over again from the old studio days. The Tab Hunter story. Hunter, the blonde, all-American dreamboat Warner Brothers pushed in the 50s, actually did appear on The Tonight Show with Carson later in life. By then, much of the old fear had softened, and Hunter would eventually speak openly about being gay. But back in the peak of his fame, Johnny knew, from agents, publicists, whispered hallway conversations, that the studio had carefully engineered dates and gossip column romances to keep his real life hidden. Hunter was set up with starlets for photo ops, while living in constant fear that exposure would kill his career. When he eventually revealed his truth in his own memoir years after Carson had retired, it confirmed what Johnny had suspected all along. The boy-next-door image millions of teenage girls had pinned to their bedroom walls had been, in part, a survival strategy. By the end of his life, Carson reportedly looked back on these decades not as a vault of juicy secrets, but as a strange kind of burden. Night after night, he'd sat at that desk holding two stories in his head, the one the audience was hearing, and the one only Hollywood insiders knew. He wasn't a saint. He played along. He punctured a few myths when it was safe. He protected far more. What seems to have haunted him most was the realization that an entire generation of stars had been forced to choose between honesty and existence. In private conversations, he was said to use a phrase that summed it up neatly. "We didn't just sell movies, we sold closets." Who do you think paid the highest price for keeping their truth off camera? Don't forget to subscribe if you want more deep dives into the myths, masks, and secret histories of classic Hollywood. The films are still the same, the performances are still brilliant, but the lives behind them? Those are the stories that were never meant to be told, and we're just beginning to unearth them.